Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today I have an interesting hand from a 5-10 no-limit hold'em cash game. We are currently in the middle of the corona epidemic, so we are stuck at home reviewing some retro hands, but they still apply to today. Turns out, poker ebbs and flows. Sometimes particular plays come in style, sometimes they go out of style. But at the end of the day, if you learn to play good, fundamentally sound poker, like we discussed thoroughly at PokerCoaching.com, you will be able to crush your opponents no matter what exploits they attempt to make. And if you are new to poker, if you've never really studied poker a ton, check out PokerCoaching.com/fundamentals. There's a course there. It's about 2 hours long with a bunch of quizzes in between each lesson that ensure you are ready to fully make use of all of the training content I have at PokerCoaching.com. And if you know anyone who's completely new to poker, it's a good place to send them so that they can learn the very basics and get up to speed to where they can talk hands with you and understand poker decently well. So check that out at PokerCoaching.com/fundamentals. All right, here we have a hand from 5-10 no limit hold'em. Folds around to the button who raises to 40 bucks. Small blind folds. We have queen nine of clubs in the big blind. This is already not a great scenario. If this was queen nine offsuit, you should probably just fold, even playing 200 big blinds deep or 190 big blinds deep. And you may say, but everyone in my game raises to 5 or 10 big blinds pre-flop. Shouldn't I defend my blinds with my hands that flop well? Well, queen nine offsuit certainly doesn't, but queen nine suited does well enough. But when your opponents are using giant pre-flop raises in a game where there is rake, right? So if you see the flop, the house just takes money out of the pot. And the fact that you're out of position, there's no ante in play like a tournament, all of these things should make you defend substantially tighter. And, I wouldn't be the least bit shocked that if the player on the button is a good, strong player, queen nine suited may actually even be a fold for a 4 big blind raise. So, funny enough, taking that into account, I opt to 3-bet it. We make it $165, which I think is fine. If this hand was a little bit weaker, like queen 8 suited or jack 8 suited, I think I'd prefer the 3-bet a little bit more because those hands are definitely not quite good enough to call. But this is a situation where a lot of people do get in the habit of just calling the big blind with any hand that flops well and then check folding every time they miss. And that is way, way, way too weak. Because also, whenever you do make a good hand with queen nine, it's going to be top pair bad kicker. And, out of position, 200 big blinds deep, top pair bad kicker is not really where you want to be. So you're usually better off taking some of these hands and bluffing with them some portion of the time. And that's what we do. If you are going to be 3-betting out of position, playing 200 big blinds deep, 190 big blinds deep, usually you're going to want to make it about 4 times the initial raise from out of position. From in position, you can go about 3 or 3.3 or 3.5 times the initial raise. But when you're out of position, you want to diminish the effect of the deep stacks to the best of your ability, and you do that by raising a little bit larger. As you get shallower, you can use a smaller size, though. Flop comes queen 8-2, giving us top pair. That's fantastic. Pot's 335 bucks. You can bet or check this hand. I think both plays are certainly viable. We go for a small bet of $110, and I would be betting frequently in this scenario with my whole range. I think if I played this hand today, I may just go a little bit bigger, like $150 into the $335 pot. That's going to result in us getting called by probably the same range. Notice that if our opponent does have any sort of gut shot here, they're just always going to call. If they have any sort of pair, they're always going to call. So I think we probably just extract a little bit more value. So I think I'd prefer a slightly bigger bet. We do bet 110, the opponent calls. Turn is the 4 of clubs, giving us a backdoor flush draw. So we have top pair, bad kicker, backdoor flush draw. Now, you have to ask, if I keep betting the turn, if I bet big on the turn, what is my opponent going to call with? And you have to be realistic about this and honest with yourself. Most people, if you continue betting the turn using a big size, are only going to call with like an 8 or better. And notice that it's kind of hard for your opponent to have an 8. I mean, they have to have like ace 8 suited, maybe king 8 suited, maybe 10 8 suited, 9 8 suited, 8 7 suited. There really aren't a ton of those. So maybe they call with like ace 2 suited, but then they also have a lot of queens, right? They have ace queen, king queen, queen jack suited, queen 10 suited, maybe queen 9 suited. And it's a scenario where if you bet big, like $400 into the 555 pot, your opponent's literally never folding a queen. They may even fold an 8 or a 2. And that's going to result in them calling when I am mostly in bad shape. So that's not what you want at all. Whenever you're value betting, you want it to be such that your opponent is calling with a lot of hands that you beat. Like if I had ace queen here, I think ace queen's a pretty easy value bet because then that whole range I just laid out, our opponent is losing with. Now, obviously, the opponent could still have ace-queen beat, but it's way less likely they have ace-queen beat than they have queen-9 beat. So you may say, but doesn't the fact that we have a flush draw mean we should be betting this? And I don't think it really matters all that much, because when we bet big and get called, we're not looking to like bluff the river. We're not trying to get our opponent off king, queen on the river, right? So when we bet this on the turn and get called, yeah, it's nice to have the flush draw for backup, but you'd rather just check and keep your opponent in the pot with their whole range. Because remember, when they call our flop bet, they're going to be in this pot with all sorts of stuff, like Jack 9 suited, right? Jack 9 suited is going to be highly incentivized to bet the turn. You know how we're doing against Jack 9 suited? They are drawing very, very thin. They're drawing to 3 outs, right? Because the 10 of clubs is no good. So this is a scenario where we are in great shape if we check and our opponent bets, but we're in only marginal shape if we bet and our opponent calls. So this is a great spot to go for a check. This time it does go check, check. So let's think about what happens when it goes check, check. When it goes check, check, our opponent's range now loses a lot of its bluffs, right? It's going to instead be more hands like small pairs, like pocket sevens that decided to call the small flop bet, or good ace high type hands like ace king, ace jack, ace 10, ace 8, ace 2. Sometimes like backdoor flush draws like ace jack of hearts or something like that. Those hands certainly could bet the turn if they felt inclined. If the opponent does bet all of those, they may be bluffing a little bit too often, because there really aren't a ton of hands they want to value bet, and they obviously have Jack 10, 10, 9, and Jack 9 suited that they would love to bluff. So they have 12, well, roughly 12, not ignoring our club. They have a decent number of bluffs that they would like to bluff in this scenario. So for that reason, I don't think they can get away with bluffing like all the random ace high type hands. Maybe they're supposed to bet like ace 5 backdoor draw, which they would call our $110 bet on the flop with. You may say, do they call our pre-flop 3 bet with ace 5 suited? Some people will. Some people call your 3 bet in position deep stack like any suited ace. So when it goes check, check, I think we're going to be against a lot of ace high. I think we're going to be against a lot of small pairs, okay? Like pocket sevens. So let's keep that in mind going to the river. River is the ace of clubs, giving me the flush. I have the second nuts. That is very good. So now we have to ask, if I bet, what's going to call? Well, the ace high is going to call, right? Because the ace high just made a pair. But the small pairs literally always fold. Okay. What happens if instead, though, I check? Well, now, if the opponent has an ace, they're almost certainly going to value bet. Like, say the opponent does have ace of jack. They're almost always going to value bet here. So we get the same amount of money in against the aces the majority of the time. I mean, maybe if he has ace 5, he checks it back, which would have called a bet if I bet. But if the opponent does have a small pair like pocket 5s or pocket 7s, now they may turn that into a bluff. I'm not saying they will, but they may. If the opponent has a hand like 8-7 suited, they may turn it into a bluff to try to get me off of perhaps what they think is an obvious pocket jacks, 10s, or 9s, right? So we get the same money in the pot against an ace if we check, and because they're going to bet, right? They're going to bet if I check, and they're going to call if I bet, for the most part. And we also give the opponent a chance to bluff. Also, there's no guarantee the opponent does not have Jack 10, right? The opponent should almost certainly bet the turn with Jack 10, but sometimes they just won't. So by checking, we give all of the non-showdown value hands, like Jack 10, maybe if they have King 10 of hearts that they decided not to bluff the turn, we give all of those hands the opportunity to bluff, and you definitely want to do that in this scenario. So whenever you're in this scenario with the effective nuts on the river, you want to ask, what does the opponent's range look like? If the opponent's range looks like a whole lot of good hands that will value bet or just total garbage, you basically always want to check the nuts. And if instead the opponent's range looks like a whole lot of marginal hands, like if, let's say we thought the opponent's range was a whole lot of queens that will check behind if I check, well, now I definitely want to bet, ideally using a sizing that those will call. In this instance, though, it's very likely the opponent has a lot of ace high, which will bet. Very likely the opponent has some very weak hands that will at least consider bluffing. And for that reason, I think we have a pretty easy check, looking to check raise. So I do check. Opponent bets $350. Nice. Now we have to decide how much should we raise. And I think we can go either way. This is a spot where how much you have been playing, how active you've been, how battling you have been with your opponent and at the table in general is very relevant. If your opponents think that you are loose, aggressive, maniacal, they're going to be way more willing to call a check raise all in than if you are kind of weak type passive. That said, in this scenario, you almost always just want to go for a big raise, because if the opponent does have an ace, they're either going to call a raise or they're not. I understand that perhaps in some small stakes games, maybe they'll always call a check min raise and never call a check raise all in. If that's the case, I guess go for a check min raise. But against anyone who's competent, they are going to realize that when you check min raise, you just like must have the nuts because you're giving them such good odds. Whereas when you check shove all in, you could easily be doing it with like the king blocker. Like say I was sitting here with king of clubs 10 or something like that. Maybe we go for the check raise all in. Thinking that if it goes check, check, we win every once in a while. But when I check and the opponent bets, I never win. So now I have to find some good blocker hands to bluff, which king of clubs certainly is. So maybe that's a hand we could check raise all in as a bluff. So in this scenario, I do go for the all in. And you may say, what can really call you? Well, if the opponent does have ace king, ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, and ace 2, right? Those are very clear hands that may call. If the opponent does have a flush, don't forget the opponent's allowed to have a flush every once in a while. Maybe the opponent floated the flop with jack 10 of clubs, decided to check turn because they don't want to get check raise, and now they have a flush. That's definitely going to call a check raise all in. I don't think that's likely, but that is certainly a possibility. One thing you'll also find is that whenever the backdoor flush arrives, a lot of people won't really put you on a flush. They'll just, a lot of people won't even see it. Remember one World Series of Poker hand where I backdoored a flush, and on the river, we got like, I don't know, it was like 300 big blinds in on level 1. And I just like had the nuts. My opponent showed up with a set. He's like, oh man, I didn't even see the flush because it was a backdoor flush. And you got to be able to read the board. Turns out people who buy into random $1,500 buy-in tournaments often can't read the board. So anyway, this is a scenario where I think we have an all-in if we are the least bit active. And if you follow our recommendations at pokercoaching.com, you will be at least somewhat active. We do go all in, opponent does call, so that's good. You may say, what if they have the king high flush? You lose. Yeah, but there's a lot of other stuff I beat. Also notice the king high flush should be a really small portion of the opponent's range. Yeah, they could have king 10, but like what else? You think they're calling the pre-flop 3-bet with, I guess they have king 10 and king jack, right? So 2 combinations. You think they think really think they have king 7 suited? I mean, they could. King 6 suited, they could. Remember, they had to call our flop bet too, and not bluff the turn. So you're starting to have to jump through a lot of hoops for the opponent to have exactly the 2 or 3 or 4 combinations that we could potentially lose to. So don't worry about that. In this scenario, there's going to be some weaker flushes and a lot of aces and a lot of 2 pairs that will feel hero call-y. But like I said, in the smaller stakes games, it's certainly reasonable to think a smaller bet may be ideal. I don't have a ton of data on that. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if your opponent's going to fold out an ace when you check raise all in, then you should probably go for a smaller ace because it is kind of hard for the opponent to have exactly the ace 8 or the ace 2 that I think has a reasonable call. So anyway, opponent kind of got set up here. And notice, though, that if I did just bet the river, take a look at this. If on the river I just bet $400, the opponent's just going to call, and I'm going to win. And a lot of people in this scenario think, all right, I bet $400, I extracted value, I did great. But in reality, you lost an extra $1,200 by not checking. So always ask, how does the river connect with my opponent's range? What does that do to their likely marginal hands, like pocket 7s in this case? Will pocket 7s call a river bet? No, it just got way worse. So I don't care about that anymore, right? What about the ace? Are ace highs in our opponent's range? Very likely, because they called a small flop bet. Check the turn. Ace high makes a lot of sense. Will they call a river bet with an ace? Sure, but if I check, will they bet the river with an ace? Probably. And when that's the case, very often you do want to go for the check raise. And when their range is very marginal, like a lot of queens or a lot of 8s, and they're always going to check those back, you probably want to go for a smallish value bet in these spots. So that's going to be it for today. Thanks for Poker News for hosting this video. If you have any questions, comments, leave them there on YouTube, or you can ask me on Twitter at Jonathan Little. Click like, click subscribe. I appreciate it. I'll talk to you next time.